Hello, Dad. This is Jay Warren, and this is the Dadhood Journey podcast. And on today's episode, I got something new. I got a guest. His name's Jason Frishman. Let's meet him.
Hi, my name's Nico, and you're listening to my dad, Jay Warren. This is the Dadhood Journey podcast. Thanks for listening.
Yep. Hello, Dad. Welcome back. And yes, I said on the last podcast episode, the reboot, restart episode, that I was going to be adding in new things and new offerings, and this episode is one of them. It's an interview with a guest. I've only had one guest on the podcast before. If you remember, it was Michael Smith. He's is the author of one of my favorite dadhood books, The Power of Dadhood. But today, I have my friend and colleague, Jason Frishman, on to share a conversation and for you to listen in on our conversation. He and I have known each other for a couple of years now. It was a colleague, a mutual colleague that had introduced us. He's a therapist on the East Coast. He specializes in men's work, and especially now as a dad, he's got tween boys. He works a lot with men around fatherhood, and that's how we got put together, and our conversations are always just amazing. And he's just a wonderful human being. He really is. He's really insightful. He's got really good practical tips. He's real. So it's really just great advice and great insight and takes on this whole thing of dadhood and just trying to be the best person we can be, the best man, the best partner, the best dad, all of it. And I've said this before in our conversations that we should really record this and have other dads listen into it, because it's such important work and such important concepts. And so that's what came of this and why it's here today. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get a lot out of it. We cover a broad range of topics in this first conversation, just for you to kind of get to know him and his work and what he's all about. But I hope you get a lot out of it. Afterwards, after the interview, I have something to share with you, an announcement, so don't go anywhere afterwards. But for right now, let me just switch over to the conversation that I had with Jason. Hope you like it. All right, Jason, welcome to the podcast. I'm glad you're here.
Awesome. Hi, it's great to be here.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking for the last 20 minutes or so, getting ready to record, and I figured, we should probably press the record button.
We missed a lot of stuff.
Yeah, we'll circle back around to it. For you listeners of the Dadhood Journey podcast, you'll notice that this is a very unique experience, in that usually my podcast is just me talking, but I've only had one other guest on the podcast. But Jason and I have been introduced is a mutual friend of ours, Erin, who is a colleague of mine. She's a chiropractor that lives in your neck of the world. And with you doing the work that you do, which we're going to explore in a second, and she put us together. And over the last times that we've been talking, I just love how deep we can go into being dads and men and how to be our best selves. And just as I said before, I wanted to record them. Every time we have a conversation about fatherhood, I want this to be shared. So that's why I invited you on, Jason. I'm glad that you're here, and we have lots and lots that we can go over. But I guess in a way, because this is the first time we've had a conversation like this on the podcast, given your kind of background, where, what you do and how you came to do this kind of stuff, I think is important. I mean, you've been a therapist for a long time, and now starting doing some of the coaching work that I'm now a part of. So where did your journey start? One, in a professional space, and then obviously dadhood brought it in as well.
Yeah, no, I think, I am unique in that I've wanted to do this almost my whole life. So I have lots of friends who maybe are still trying to figure out what they want to do, but I have been in the helping profession for as long as I could remember. And I started working mostly with boys. So I worked with children for a very long time. In fact, I used to joke that, if you're I used to say, I work with kids, I work with boys. if you're an adult and you're a jerk, it's too late. That's kind of what I used to say. And, you know, the more I worked with kids, the more I had to work with adults, and the more powerful I saw that when adults make changes, it's so powerful for kids. And so, and then I had my own kids, and frankly, I wanted the energy that I gave to kids to go to my kids and to go to my kids' friends, and we have a very tight community here in Vermont, and I have had a lot of mentors and whatnot who have shared some of the fact that, like, if you spend all day with all of your energy go to the kids, it's hard, it's much more difficult. And so I slowly raised the age of the kids I worked with. I started working more with older adolescents and college kids. And then about, I'd say between 10 and 15 years ago, I switched to almost exclusively working with men. And about 10 years ago, I started a men's therapeutic group that has been incredibly powerful and wonderful. It went on for about 8 or 9 years. We had it every Wednesday, and it was
that's impressive.
Some of my best, most like memorable clinical moments where I just got like a bunch of guys together, and we would talk about what it was like. We had, at one point, I had 8 guys in like 6 different decades of life.
Oh, wow.
20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and a 70-year-old. You know, it was like this really powerful experience. So yeah, like the more I saw the men that I worked with, the more I saw how incredibly rewarding it was for me and powerful it was for me to give and create space for guys. I used to joke with a lot of my men. I see almost exclusively men now in my psychotherapy practice, and I used to joke that for every one of them who comes in, you know, there's 30 to 50 other guys who wouldn't do this. And so these guys are my heroes.
I love that.
Know? And so then my fatherhood journey started, and, you know, it's kind of fun. I was telling someone earlier, the group practice that I'm involved with right now for therapy, I joined the week my older son was born.
Oh, wow.
So I know that I've been at this practice for 13 years. And in the month that my oldest son was born, it was my birthday, my wife's birthday. He was born. I passed my licensing boards. We moved. I joined a private practice, and I finished my fellowship.
Unreal.
All within a month.
That's crazy.
So, you know, the whole thing has always been, you know, around my family and around fatherhood. And you know, in this sense, I've always, it's been a really powerful thing. And, you know, I have 2 sons, a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old. And when my 10-year-old was born, my wife found us. She, you know, he was born at home, and she was like she got out of bed for the first time, you know, and then, you know, a couple days later, it wasn't the first time, but a couple days later, and she walked in on us where I was sitting on the floor with my newborn baby on my lap, and my 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old and I were both singing to the baby.
Oh.
And I turn around and I see my wife sort of tearing up, and she says, "We were meant to raise boys." And so really, since then, it's been a passion of mine, not just my own boys, but really this idea that men raising boys and men raising themselves really is social activism. It is something that can change the world. It's something that is really powerful because, you know, frankly, men have had there's been a lot of conflict and struggle around men and men's work, and you know, I see that, you know, every time a man steps off of anger or steps towards a different emotional connection or whatnot, as social activism, as building social responsibility.
That's so beautiful. I mean, powerful to just know you're doing that kind of work every day, working with dads.
Oh, it's been really great. And that's been the change of like wanting to go from my psychotherapy practice to more of a coaching practice, is because it allows me to broaden the work and really step it outside of my office and bring it to beyond Vermont.
Right.
Really.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know like the group of guys you've put together for that, and I get to be a part of too. Like, Are they mostly in the East Coast, or am I the one like West
Oh
Coaster?
no, we have, let's
It's
see,
all over,
so
yeah.
it's all over. There's California, New Mexico, Milwaukee, um, and then I think the other guys are all on the East Coast.
Like the East
But
Coast,
but
yeah.
but yeah, we are from all over in a lot of
Yeah,
ways.
and I've only been a part of it for the last couple of weeks, but like things that we're like discussing like as men together is something I've been craving for a long time. And like so I thank you, one, for inviting me in, two, for putting it together. And then this conversation I see is of more of the same, right? Like the dads that I work with as well are, not ones that really have to like pull into being a dad or being a father. They're ones that want to be active and they want to be a great dad. They're just trying to figure it out, just like we all are, and struggling like we all are, but in different ranges, and to have like more of a context of, all right, like what are we looking for as like a man to be a father, and what do we want for our kids, and who are our kids, and see our kids as they are rather than what we want them to be, I think is a big thing. And there's so much we're pulled in so many directions. I say this generationally, right? Like the dads today are way more involved than they ever have been, but because it's new, we kind of don't know what we're doing. And
Yeah,
sometimes we're just reacting to the way that we were raised ourselves. And sometimes you're like, all right, I'm just going to do it the way my dad did, or I'm doing the exact opposite instead of taking a pause and really crafting it what we want. And I think that's
absolutely.
something that like most of these dads like are, wanting guidance and direction, man.
Well, absolutely. And I think there's on so many levels. I really like the way you said it, right? Like it's either going to be just like my dad or the opposite of my dad. And there's so much else in that spectrum.
Right.
And, you know, you and I have talked about this before, but I'm pretty passionate about stories and narratives and tales and culture. And our culture does not really have many stories for fathers. We have
Yeah.
stories for young men, we have stories for children, and we actually have stories for old men. We don't have a lot of stories for the middle ground because frankly that has not been, like it's not been highlighted in what's important in our culture. We all have stories of the hero, we have stories of the king, we have stories of the warrior, and that's, my argument has been that that leaves out a lot.
Right.
And it very much narrows what we can give our kids.
That makes sense. And I know for me, like having that discussion around, the hero's journey and slaying dragons and the like, I've been so like enamored by that. Star Wars is my favorite. I love the
Yeah.
Matrix, like Lord of the Rings, like, and the underneath it, which I've never really like paid attention to until the last like couple of years of my life, and just even having our conversations recently, is that I'm always comparing myself to slaying dragons, and when I'm not, because I don't, I'm a dad,
Mm.
I go to work, I do some cool things, but it's not slaying dragons, that I feel I'm not doing enough, or I'm not living like the big life, and it's not meaningful. And your perspective on that, to like kind of bring it down into like, how can the day to day be an adventure, because adventure is really important to me. I love it. And at the same time, when I'm not, killing it and like going all across the country and doing stuff, and especially with my son, then it just doesn't feel as meaningful. And that I can undermine myself by not giving myself some credit. And that I think you hit really well when we were first talking about how, like, Joseph Campbell got it wrong.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
love that.
The original name for the program that I developed was Adventure's Other Half.
Ah.
And yesterday I was wearing the shirt. um, but but the thing is that you're right. Like, and you and I have talked a lot about how important it is when, you mentioned it, you referred to it before about, being pulled in so many ways, and like how important it is to be present with ourselves, with our kids, with our partners, with our families, whatever. But if we see that as being less than, if we see that as not, being, not battling the dragon, then I'm going to be having almost every excuse possible to not do that. And yet we
Mm-hmm.
know that's the most important thing.
Right.
Joseph Campbell was wrong. And, I think he was writing, he was amazing. He's one of my favorite people. I love Star Wars, all of that. But I absolutely agree. I see it in the men that I've worked with for the last 10 years, where even though these movies that are my favorite movies, books, epic stories, epic fantasy, sci-fi, all of those, I am now at a place where I would say that the sort of omnipresence of this story is actually damaging to men.
Mm.
And by consequence damaging to families and to children, and because it's the only, it just, Campbell called it the monomyth, the only myth.
Mm. Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's just clearly not.
Right.
There's a lot more to it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more to what we need as both men and caregivers and humans.
Right. Well, and that's not, I didn't think about it in that way, in that if I'm thinking to have an adventurous, meaningful, awesome life, I need to be slaying a dragon. When I'm not, that I might be pulling myself out of the moment in order to create that adventure, rather than me thinking like I'm always distracted, because that's a big challenge I have as a dad of, all right, I want to be fully present when I'm with Nico, and not be pulled to go do laundry or Monday, like those kind of things, or answering emails or, something else. But it makes sense in that if I've always been driven of like, I should be like preparing and heading out to battle, that inside of me would bubble up as the little stuff of being distracted. Whereas really instead of what my son most likely wants isn't like the dragon slayer. He just wants like his dad to like play with him and to be with him and to hear him and to be with him.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, you've heard me say this before, but all my life I wanted to be Luke Skywalker, and now I realize I'm Obi-Wan.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is, it's no longer our job to be the dragon slayer.
Mm.
We have to actually help build the foundation for our boys to do that.
Hmm.
Or our children, actually, our
Right.
kids. And it's an interesting thing, because then also, what if our kids don't want to do that either? If that's the only story we give them, then they feel bad about it.
Right.
And so being able to just be with them is the adventure, and to be just present. And one thing I want to just put out, though, is that, like, having studied a lot of the metaphor of these stories and things like that, like, one might suggest that working on a challenge, like distraction, not being distracted and being present, that is your dragon, right? So that is you doing the dragon. And in some different ways of thinking, that would be the explanation of why it is the monomyth, why it is, because we all have our dragons every day. I argue that dragons are dragons, but the everyday things, they're not dragons. Those are things, I call them imps. I call them, they're like the little tricksters that get in the way, but also have something to teach us.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's important, because if you think about it, in these big epic movies and stories and tales, the most we ever get, right? Like, the hero is about to go to the dragon and he's got a sword. The most we ever get is like a 3-minute montage of how he trained with the sword. But the practical reality is, he had to train a lot with the sword in order to be with this dragon, right? But we're not told that story. That story doesn't sell.
Right. Yeah.
And yet I would say that it's so important to have a foundation. You don't build a house on a rocky foundation. You want a strong foundation.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
I mix my metaphors there, but
That's right. Well, I mean, when you were talking about it, brings me back to, in Star Wars, like the whole thing in Empire of Luke being with Yoda, like, was a very small part of things. And, and then all of a sudden he leaves and he's like going to battle Darth Vader, right? Instead of, all right, I did some push-ups, I did a handstand with Yoda on my feet, like I ran through the jungle, and now I'm ready to go. Although that, in a way of a storytelling, like that time could have been years. It's just down into a small period of time. But I like that, like, as far as going back to the your imps, like little dragons every day, of like, how can I bring adventure to like being not distracted and pulling myself back in, rather than something bigger than that. And that's something, I mean, I'll share going over last week, like talking about like being pulled and not being present. And you gave a little exercise to be like you call it the PCG, right? Like the being present, curious, and grateful. And it's made a big difference to like reset. Do you mind going through that for people?
Oh,
Like how you came up with it and like what it really means?
absolutely. I'd love to. In fact, I love sharing the story because it's something that I built with my son. And so
Mm-hmm.
um, he, I've shared this with you, but everything that I do in my work outside of therapy, because obviously I can't share any of the confidential stuff, but any of the work that I'm doing, any of the development or the research or any of those things, I share with my kids. They know the work I'm doing. And there's a vulnerability in that, because then if I'm talking about not being distracted, and I'm on my phone while I'm playing a game with them, they're like, "You're being distracted."
Right.
So it empowers my boys in a way that I feel is both vulnerable but incredibly powerful. So that being said, um, you know, we all have struggles, and my 13-year-old has some of his own, and we were talking about the struggles, and I don't know exactly how it came up, but he knows that I like to play with words. And so the word that we were playing with was the word wonderful.
Okay.
And I turned the word into two words: wonderful, being full of wonder.
Okay.
And he looked at me and he goes, "You can't really be worried if you're full of wonder, can you?" And I was like, "Oh, snap. Like, like you're right." Like, and we talked a little bit about what being full of wonder would mean, right? Like being full of curiosity, being full of awe, like, like being like awed by the world, but also like curious about it and like in it, and frankly being, like in the moment, right? And so I asked him, I said, "Well, how could we become more full of wonder? Like we should do that. Like that's important."
Right.
And in our conversation, we came up with 3 steps to become more full of wonder. And I sometimes call it PCG because it's a mnemonic to remember it. Sometimes I just call it the wonders.
Okay.
I might say, if I see my kids getting anxious or whatever from across the room, I could say, "Hey man, do your wonders."
Okay.
Do your wonders.
Yeah.
He would do that. He also has a big joke because it's PCG, but I always mess it up. I'm like GCP, DP. And so, after I taught it in our group last week, I told him about that, and he was like, "Did you get it right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I got it right." He's like, "Good, you need to get it right because the order is important." So
Right.
This is the order, right? The way to become full of wonder is to first become present. So what we do is, because the goal is really like 1 minute or less, like to do this quick so that you can work, right? So to get present is really to quickly go through your 5 senses. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you touch? What do you hear? What can you taste? And be done. And that's it. Like that just brings you right here, right?
Okay.
And then the next one, that's the P. The next one is C, is curiosity, right? What are you curious about in your moment right now? And that's a hard one, because if you're anxious, you might be pulled to being curious towards that, and that pulls you into it, which is why we become present first, and why the direction is, what are you curious about what you were just present to? So there's a sequence.
So you're not curious, like say if you're anxious, you're not curious about solving the anxiety.
No.
You're curious about what you might have experienced in your 5 senses in being
Exactly.
present. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Like, I'm curious right now, or I'm present right now. Like I'm sitting in my room, I'm warm, I'm hot, I'm talking to you, I can see the screen, all of those things. What am I curious about? What am I curious about that experience? And it's a hard one in some ways, because not only are we pulled towards maybe the anxiety or the other things, the distractions, but it's also like, I don't know, what am I curious? I'm curious what time it is. I'm curious about how my tea is tasting. Like, I don't know. But the middle portion of any story that we're building, and this is a story, we're building our wonderful story. The middle portion is often the most difficult. And that's something we can talk about some other time. But like, you are setting the stage by being present. Like, here I am. And then you're doing some work, like, what am I curious about? What do I want to think about here, right? And then the last one, which is the G, is gratitude, right? I'm present, I'm curious, and then whatever it is that I was curious about, I want to engender some gratitude towards.
Okay.
So it's focused. It's not, I'm grateful about anything. I'm grateful to have this conversation with you. But if that's not what I was curious about, then I'm going to add something else, right?
Right.
And so I'm present, my five senses. I'm curious about something I've experienced, and then I'm grateful for that thing I was curious about. And in doing that, it brings you like right into the moment. And because you finish with gratitude, it feels nice. And gratitude is something that many people know, like over the last 10 years, mindfulness has become a big buzzword in mental health and wellness. Gratitude is the next stage of that. A lot of people are using in meditation and in mindful work, gratitude practices, because it is something that it builds empathy, it builds awareness, it brings thought outside of our own head. And so in this kind of practice, it can leave you with a sense of like, oh, I'm feeling good, and that's a really nice way to get set. And to the point where, if I'm having an issue with my kids, they can call out, hey, Papa, I think you need to do your wonders. And we'll stop right then and there and spend a couple minutes doing it.
That's so cool. That's definitely something I would like between my son and I to have him. That, I mean, we don't have it as laid out as this, but there's times where I'm like distracted. I'm getting grumpy about not getting things done the way we want to and things like that. And I'll pause and I'm like, all right, I'm being grumpy, Dad. Hold on. Let me reset. And he's like, Dad, you're being grumpy, Dad. Like, but he doesn't say, let's do our wonders, but I see that in our future, right? Because these tools have been working. So that would be so great.
Well, and you said something that is important that we talked about in the group even, was like the importance of naming.
Yeah.
Right. You named Grumpy Dad, and you named it so that now he can name it.
Right.
And that's, if you teach him the wonders, he's got these names. And that's, naming things becomes so powerful, because without that, specifically with kids don't have the language for it.
Yeah.
Right. And so if we give them the language, we can say, hey, this is blank. Oh, okay, well, I can now use that.
Right. And I think, your kids are a little older, like Nico's 7 now, but it's never too young to like start these kind of processes of, becoming more present, more aware. I mean, I'm doing them for myself as his dad, as a person, because what I've noticed in the last week, having used these, and curiosity, like you just went a little deeper, that I was doing it in a different way. But even when I was doing something and felt myself distracted, I would become present, but I was being curious about why I got distracted rather than curious about like what's present here. But ending with the gratitude did shift things, like, all right, things are like way better than I was thinking they were just a second ago. Like, how can I restart? And I think that's something that all of that, I mean, every human has that challenge, but the dads that I hear a lot from are saying like, gosh, like I need to like clone myself to be able to get done everything I need to get done or feel I should, as well as be a good dad. And it's almost like there's a separation of, once I get everything done, then I'll be a good dad. Or if I'm being a good dad, stuff's not getting done. And I think that integration, I think, is the next step, a really important part.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And you're right. Like, and that actually I hadn't even thought about, but that sense of like, once I do blank, I'll be able to do blank.
Yeah.
That is in our culture, right? Like, I have to get this done in order to have this. When I'm 18, I'll be able to do this. When I graduate, I'll do this. Like, as soon as I can drive, I'll do this. And I think you're right. Like, particularly for the fathers that I work with, there is that sense. It's like, well, I have to get this next job, or I got to make enough money for, or all of these things. And you're absolutely right. Like, how do you integrate? And how do you, there's a term, satisficer, right?
Satisficer.
How can you be someone who, like, it's good enough? Like, it's okay.
Is that a real word, or did you make that up?
I think it's a real word. It's something that and there's an opposite.
I don't care. I just wanted to know like where it came from, because I love words in that way too. And like, that's something I'm craving. Like, it's enough. Like, well,
Yeah. I will. I'll look it up, but I remember. I think I remember it from my grad school days that there's actually an opposite too. You're either a satisficer or a blank, and that's like the type A. It's got to be perfect. It's got whatever.
Yeah.
And so it's a personality descriptor. I don't remember exactly, but the concept of like, oh, like, doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be this. Like, I'm gonna get this done, and so that I can do blank, or I'm going to do it like my kids. I'm a cook. I like to cook a lot, and my kids have often been in the kitchen with me. And when they cook with me, it's never going to be as gourmet as I would do it if it was myself. It's never going to be as fast. It's never going to be as clean. It's never going to like that's just okay. But the trade-off is I get to be with my kids.
Yeah.
You know, the trade-off is that I had a 3-year-old who was able to make mushroom omelets.
That's amazing.
You know? So, those were ugly omelets.
Sure.
But, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. That's impressive. Yeah. And I think that like kind of going back to, it's never going to be, that's a thing that a lot of dads have a challenge is like, I wasn't ready to become a dad yet, I don't know if that's necessarily been said, but the couples that I talk to that are like trying to get pregnant in my clinical practice, like there's always like checking off all these boxes and then we'll be ready to have kids. It's like, we need to be married long enough. We need to have enough space. We need to have enough money. Work needs to settle down, like all those kind of things. And like, there's no good time to have a kid. And there's always a perfect time to have a kid, which is now, right? But if you feel like you're behind, then it's like, well, okay, I didn't have enough money when kid came around. So I need to like work more to get those, or we didn't solidify these kind of things. And that distracts from like having this cute little kid in front of you that just doesn't care about all that kind of stuff, but just cares about having you be present.
Which brings it back to some of the hero's journey stuff. Like, if I haven't already slain the dragon and become the king, then I'm not ready to do everything.
Right. Yeah.
And frankly, that's not the only story that we should have. And then, that's not the only way to look at these things. And so, I think you're right. Like there's this need to understand and accept, and it's really hard, but this need to understand and accept that like, life is sort of a zero-sum game, right? I've got 24 hours in a day. If I choose an hour to do this, I'm not going to do this. And how do you handle that with a maturity and a responsibility that allows for both the disappointment of not choosing something and the presence for choosing another thing?
Right.
And to balance and hold that. And that, that I think is the task for father. That's one of the tasks for fathers. I think it would be great if we taught our kids that, but particularly for dads, is to be able to say, like, this is something that I have to balance, and it's okay.
Right.
You'll see in the next couple of weeks, one of the next things that I do a lot in this group is, it's a concept, I don't know if I should made the term up, but I use it a lot with men, is radical responsibility taking. And so that sense of like, even if it's not your fault, you can take responsibility for it.
Yeah.
And, there's a dark side to that, but again, it has to be balanced, right? Like we can take so much responsibility that we beat up for ourselves for it. Yeah. But at the same time, then we have to take responsibility for that.
Right. Yeah. That's deep. Well, I mean, there's so much we could go into. I think like we should continue the conversation, keep going in other episodes if you're open to it.
We should totally do this. It'd be great.
Yeah, because I think like even just I want to close on this, but like part of another reason why I wanted to bring you on and like have these kind of conversations is because in the dads group that I do monthly, at first I was thinking like, all right, it needs to be like a teaching moment. Like we're going to go over this, like in this meeting, we're talking about like bedtime routines or whatever it is, like some dad skill. And what I found is that dads just wanted to get together with other dads and talk about like dadness, like maybe life, but also like these kind of things instead of having it be something that's so, didactic and teaching. I mean, I've learned a lot from this conversation, but I think like each time we talk, there's going to be other stuff that everyone listening can get a lot out of. I know I do. So I appreciate you for being here. Like I appreciate the work that I'm doing with you, and I'm just looking forward to lots and lots more.
Oh, me too. Likewise. I think it's so important. And you're right. we could make lots of things about the details of dadding, of fatherhood, right? How to give a timeout, how to go to bedtime, how to, all those things. And they become a little bit soulless. And,
Yeah.
you and I have said this before, my passion is really not about teaching dads how to be a father, but rather teaching dads how to be stronger, better men, because they know how to be a father. And if we unleash that, I think we have a lot better chance to do better.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Well, and I was right too, that this conversation was amazing, and I'm glad we recorded it.
Me too. That's awesome.
All right. Well, thank you again for being here, Jason. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
All right, so there you have it. I hope you got a lot out of this conversation, and I want to continue this conversation over in the Dadhood Journey Facebook group. That's what I wanted to tell you about, that the Facebook group is back up and running. It's for dads only. So if you find your way to Facebook, you search in groups for the Dadhood Journey, and you'll answer a couple of questions to make sure you're a dad, and then you'll be admitted in. And this episode is going to be posted, lots of other things posted too. I want you to join the community of men that are getting together to just try and be the best dads they can be, to learn, to teach, and to be supported along the way, because we are not meant to do this alone. We are meant to do it together. And I want you to join this tribe of guys that just take being a dad really seriously and want to be the best that they can be. So I hope to see you over there. Go over to Facebook and join the Dadhood Journey group. See you there.